Good evening there, everybody. Hopefully, you all are having a very wonderful day today. So, this is going to be my little boxing breakdown, and this is going to be my fight review, of course, of the very interesting fight that ended up happening between Anderson Silva, of course, a former UFC very dominant champion within that organization, one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time, of course, for those of you that do not necessarily know or remember him. And then, of course, the problem child, at least of boxing right now, or of YouTube boxing, Jake Paul. And of course, for those of you that did not end up hearing the results, Jake Paul did end up winning this by unanimous decision, which unfortunately I did not end up putting out there. So, I can't necessarily say that with 100% accuracy that I ended up getting my prediction right, because unfortunately I cannot really get around to my prediction and posting it on YouTube. However, I did predict Jake Paul to win this fight by unanimous decision. And the fight somewhat went along as what I thought. What I will say is this: Anderson Silva did a little bit better than what I personally even expected. I did not expect him to be as action orientated as what he actually was. And I thought that once he started to feel the punches, now understandably, he is a very experienced fighter, but I thought that maybe the age overall and being 47 years old, and also him, I believe, being knocked out, a couple of times, especially in the latter part of his career, I thought that maybe he was going to retreat a little bit. And there could have been moments in the fight where Anderson Silva could have been a little bit more aggressive. But I give Anderson Silva a lot of credit. He pretty much did whatever he could do. And you also have to give a lot of credit to Jake Paul. Because, in my opinion, Jake Paul, for a guy that has the little amount of boxing experience as what he has, and to face former MMA fighters, I mean, understandably, Anderson Silva is not a ranked boxer or anything like that of a sort, but he is not the worst boxer that I've ever seen for an MMA fighter. He's certainly better than what Tyron Woodley was. And there's no offense against Woodley. He was a decent champion. He also was very one dimensional within the striking. If you get past a very decent left hook and an overhand right from Tyron Woodley, you pretty much overall have him beating in the striking category because he really doesn't have much variety and dimensions within his striking. Anderson Silva, however, even for an MMA fighter, even in terms of boxing, talents, he is a very decent striker. He knows how to use his lead hand when it comes down to it. Of course, he's a southpaw, which proved to be a little bit troubling for Jake Paul. And I'll also give him this amount of credit. When he was on the inside and when he was within the clinch, he threw decent punches on the inside. He was able overall to get a decent amount of uppercuts and land certain punches on the inside. And if you're asking me, do I think that Anderson Silva did enough to win this fight? No, not at all. I thought that it was very clear that Jake Paul ended up winning the fight. And listen, a lot of people over are gonna, look at this, and a lot of people, of course, don't like Jake Paul. Well, it's not really about whether you like them or not. And I've always stated that, or when it comes to fighters and when it comes to ranking certain things, at least when it comes to athletes and sports, things that we can rank logically and objectively. I understand that a certain amount of people don't like Jake Paul, but I've seen a certain amount of people overall saying that, oh, Jake Paul won this fight, it was rigged, it was fixed. No, this fight was not fixed. And don't get me wrong, I've seen the rematch with Tyron Woodley and the twisting of the wrist, and I can understand why a certain amount of people, believe that that fight was fixed. There is a chance overall that that fight was fixed, or a decent chance that that fight was fixed. But do I believe that this fight was fixed? No. Jake Paul went through way too much trouble within this fight, in my opinion, for it to be fixed, as well as Anderson Silva. And you should have seen his face. It was very bloodied within this fight. Not the worst that I've ever seen, but you could clearly tell that they were going at each other very hard. And I give Anderson Silva a great amount of credit once again because he is not naturally a boxer. And once again, certain people may say, well, he is a very experienced MMA fighter. Even at 47 years old, he probably should have won the fight, right? But boxing is just different with certain things that they train. You're trained to be a little bit slicker. You're trained to have more head movement. You're trained to keep your chin down a little bit. That way you can take punches a little bit better. So boxing and MMA striking, even though both very useful. If you're talking about an MMA fighter and a boxer, even someone that is as inexperienced as what Jake Paul is, the fact that he's only been trained in boxing for the past few years or maybe several years, however long it's been now, he still is mainly going to have the advantage almost over every single MMA fighter, even if they possibly may be somewhat of top of the line fighters, unless maybe they're similar in size or something like that. Because and it's not that MMA fighters have bad hand striking, but it's just different. It just is what it is. Just like if you have a boxer going to the UFC or the octagon, they'll be able to compete in terms of the hand be hand, but they won't be able to compete with the kicks or the grappling the same. It just is what it is. But I thought clearly that Jake Paul ended up winning the fight. I did end up missing the first 2 rounds of the fight, but in my opinion, it really didn't matter because I started watching this fight from the third round onward. And to be quite honest with you, excuse me, in my opinion, it was very hard for me to even give a single round to Anderson Silva. And it's not that he didn't try, it's not that he did not get in his amount of strikes overall. And I've seen certain predictions out there to where certain people predicted Jake Paul to win by knockout. I also seen certain channels like an Aki TV, for example, who I reviewed many times in the past. And of course, I think oftentimes he can be out of proportion. But I seen him predict Anderson Silva to win by knockout. I knew damn well that Anderson Silva was not going to win by knockout. And the reason why that was because as soon as I seen the Chavez Jr. fight, Anderson Silva, it was very clear that he was very uncomfortable within that fight. And to be quite honest with you, and I'm not really sure about this, it could just be that Chavez Jr. was completely done within that fight because he pretty much has been done for the past several years. But I would not be shocked whatsoever if Chavez Jr., if all in all, he pretty much was just used as a leverage piece to really set up the Silva versus Paul fight because Chavez Jr. threw so little within that fight, and it looked like he was almost purposely missing punches at times. I mean, it could just be that all in all that Chavez Jr. has been mentally done pretty much ever since his loss to Andre Fonfara. But when it comes down to it, all in all, he had a very very bad performance, and there was no way that as a professional boxer, even with Silva being a decent boxer, that you should have ended up losing that as a former champion. It just is what it is. I would not be surprised at all if Chavez Jr. all in all took a major, major paycheck to lose that fight and then pretty much overall go off somewhere else. It wouldn't shock me at all. Now, of course, that is alleged and I can't prove that. That's just me saying that it's a possibility. But what I seen in that Chavez Jr. fight was that Anderson Silva, even though he was outboxing him, it did appear to me that Anderson Silva was a little bit uncomfortable and he didn't know overall sometimes what angles and what punches really to take advantage of. And I seen the same thing here. And that's why he ended up getting knocked down in the last round once again, overall by Jake Paul with the right hand. And I knew that Jake Paul was not going to knock him out because it looked more like a balanced shot with that right hand. But the reason why Anderson Silva ended up getting knocked down is because his feet were way too square. His feet were way too square. And what that means, all in all, is that he did not have one of his feet to really help him balance him overall, in the back. Both of his feet were almost pretty much within the same place, as if they were, how overall do I explain this? Horizontally, I guess, if you want to put it that way, almost in the same position. And, basically what you're, trained with overall within boxing, even sometimes in MMA, is that you must overall have a stance to where you have a decent back foot supporting. That way you don't get knocked down as easy. But it is what it is. I think that shows a little bit, once again, of the inexperience of Anderson Silva in terms of boxing. But Jake Paul, in my opinion, very clearly won the fight. And of course, you're going to have a certain amount of people that get in their emotions and a certain amount of other people saying, oh, no way he won this fight. And I see certain people overall saying it was fixed and, complexion for the protection, all sort of stupid bullshit. Listen, it's no offense whatsoever. But the majority of people, especially when it comes to boxing, most people are really not qualified to talk about a fight because most people really don't know how to score a fight whatsoever. It just is what it is. Most people overall do not know how to score a boxing fight or an MMA fight or really talk about sports in general. It just is what it is. All right. So a lot of those people really don't know what the hell they're talking about. No, Jake Paul very clearly won the fight. It just is what it is. It's nothing to get up in arms about. It's nothing to get pissed off about. Anderson Silva tried his best. The man was 47 years old. And on top of that, he's not a boxer. Now, had Anderson Silva maybe been 10 years younger, if this was Anderson Silva, the champion, it could be that Anderson Silva maybe would have beat Jake Paul. But even then, it may have still been a little bit difficult. And the reason why that is because, once again, MMA fighters are not boxers. And understandably, once again, Jake Paul is not a fighter that, once again, he's not a Canelo Alvarez or anything like that. He's not a Lomachenko or a Crawford, whoever you want to compare him to, a top-of-the-line boxer. But he is talented and skilled enough, and he's been trained enough to look out for certain strikes, especially against MMA fighters that are inexperienced, against certain feints and certain movements and also certain tactics, to the point overall to where he's able to take advantage of that. And he was very clearly able to take advantage of that. Now, there was certain times to where Anderson Silva looked like he was landing more than Jake Paul, but the punches, in my opinion, were usually mostly landing against his arms or his hands. Jake Paul, and one thing I'll also say about Jake Paul is this: you do have to give him a great amount of credit within this fight. And I'm not going to say that I was surprised necessarily by his heart within this fight from Jake Paul. But I will say that I was a little bit surprised by his tenacity and overall some of the things that he actually showed with some of his boxing IQ. Now, once again, this is not me stating that he is a grade level boxing intellect necessarily, but he tied up when he needed to. He covered up in the corners really when he needed to. And what I'll say is this: we can say all we want to about Jake Paul that sure, he's not really a real boxer and all that sort of stuff, but at the end of the day, out of any other YouTuber or out of any other person, when it comes down to it, you're talking about a guy that once upon a time was a YouTuber. Now, maybe he took up boxing within his spare time within that time. I don't really know. Maybe he was big into it before he ended up doing professional boxing. But for what I know, anyways, the experience that he has, he certainly is not nearly as bad overall as what I've seen from others. He certainly is not an Anderson Gibb or whatever the hell that one dude's name is. He's better than his brother Logan Paul. He's better than KSI. He's better than a certain amount of the other guys that I have personally seen. So it just is what it is. So Jake Paul, when it comes down to it, once again, I have to give him a lot of credit overall for this performance. In my opinion, he showed a lot of tenacity, a lot of heart, and overall, he actually showed that he knew what to do in certain troubling situations. And it was going to be very interesting because when he was in that Tyron Woodley fight, at least the first time around, when it came down to it, he overall very clearly was a little bit stressed out, in my opinion, and he didn't know how to react in certain moments. It was only because Tyron Woodley really, once again, has very, very one dimensional striking, and certain people, once again, they'll get mad at that, but it is what it is. If you've watched him throughout his UFC career, you know what I'm talking about. It just is what it is. And on top of that, Tyron Woodley, he was a little bit washed up himself. So, he had a little bit of problems overall throwing, and knowing when to throw. But Jake Paul, once again, I was actually somewhat impressed within this fight. Do I think that he's going to beat Canelo Alvarez or anything like that? No, he's not going to beat any of those guys. But once again, I give him a certain amount of credit for being a former YouTuber overall, or someone that, at least from what I know, from my knowledge, someone all in all that did not really take up boxing until about maybe, 5 to 6 years ago, however long it's been now. And the man's 6-0. He was able to beat once upon a time world class athletes. Nate Robinson, he was able to beat Anderson Silva, Tyron Woodley, even certain people with fighting experience. Now, once again, they're not boxers. But Jake Paul, when it comes down to it, it's very clear that, he's not the worst talented boxer that I've ever seen. Now, is he, much better than some really talented guy that maybe you would see within, some local gyms that maybe you could find within the area? No, but all in all, he certainly, is not the worst that I have ever seen. I've certainly seen worse guys overall within the boxing gym. I've certainly seen worse guys overall, fight within these exhibitions or within these boxing matches. And let me also give a great amount of credit to the other contenders or the other internet stars or the other overall, football stars like that of a Le'Veon Bell, I believe, who ended up fighting Uriah Hall. Now, I did predict Uriah Hall to win that fight, but one thing I will say about Le'Veon Bell is this, or Le'Veon Bell, however you pronounce his name, I also have to give him a great amount of credit as well. And also that one Russian doctor, apparently, I don't remember the dude's name. Now, of course, he ended up getting his ass kicked, but you still have to give the man a great amount of credit. He showed a lot of courage, he showed a lot of heart, and on top of that, he didn't get stopped against a real trained MMA fighter. So that's what I keep saying. Jake Paul, once again, he's not going to beat Canelo or anything like that. But at the end of the day, it's very clear that he's better overall than the average guy that would step in there. So it is what it is, and that's all he really needed to be, at least within this fight. He at least appears to be decent. So it is what it is. But let me also give a great amount of credit to Le'Veon Bell. Of course, he did end up getting beat against Uriah Hall, but this is actually my opinion about Le'Veon Bell. I actually don't think that he appears to be bad at the sport of boxing. I just think that, once again, kind of like Anderson Silva, he hasn't really been fully trained yet to look out for certain feints or look out for certain punches. Because Le'Veon Bell, in my opinion, he actually was using his jab decently well. He was putting his head in decent positions, but he just really didn't have any defense within that fight. And on top of that, it looked like the stamina and the pressure of Uriah Hall looked like it was giving him problems. So it just is what it is. But I give credit overall to all contenders and all fighters on this card. I thought that it was very particularly interesting. I give Silva a great amount of credit overall for showing up in the fight and probably being the toughest fight so far in Jake Paul's career. But I don't think overall that it clearly was enough for Jake Paul to lose the fight. I think Jake Paul clearly was landing the more concise and consecutive and better shots. And if you don't believe it, go ahead and take a look at the face of both fighters. It just is what it is. And that's not always something that you can rely upon, but within this fight you can. So it is what it is. But anyways, congratulations to Mr. Jake Paul. I'm going to be very particularly interested to see maybe who he could face next. I would like to see maybe the Rahman fighter, who I believe is a professionally ranked boxer, or at least somewhat. Of course, there's always possibly, I believe, the Tommy Fury fight. I don't believe that fight's going to happen next, but we'll see. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later, and we'll see where this goes next. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later.